Globalization started at the beginning of World War One and was the deciding factor that made our world what it is today. Globalization is what brought telephones, the radio, the television, computers, and the internet, and improved ways of transportation. During World War One, airplanes made the war a lot different than people were used to. Automobiles such as cars made it easier to travel from place to place. The telephone made it easier to communicate with friends and family. The radio and television made it easier to advertise things or to report what is going on in the war so that everyone knows what is going on. Space travel was a great accomplishment for the whole world because it answered a lot of questions that people had about space. GPS systems were made because space travel occurred as well. Fossil fuels became a power source for most things that were electric. In the 20th century, global population soared because of the better medicine, plentiful food, and healthier habits. In the 20th century, people lived longer than ever before. In the mid 20th century, development of powerful fertilizers and pesticides started the Great Revolution, which changed farming forever. The Green Revolution held out hope that food could be grown anywhere. In the Philippines, rice fields soared, but in much of Africa, agricultural production stagnated. With the benefits of enormous industrial growth came pollution of the environment on levels never seen before. World War One introduced mass production techniques to the battlefield, such as machine guns. The first truly global disease epidemic was partly a result of World War One. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed roughly 20 million people worldwide. AIDS was the second major pandemic of the 20th century. As many as 25 million people died from the disease by the early 21st century. AIDS is the leading cause of death in Africa due to unprotected sex. One result of modern war on civilian populations is a disruption of the food supply. Communism was developed by Karl Marx in Germany in the mid-19th century and put in place by Vladimir Lenin in Russia in the early 20th century. Communism was spread around the globe in the 20th century and competed with capitalist societies. After communism fell in Europe in the late 20th century, there were revelations of massive industrial pollution higher than ever seen before in the West. In 2011, an earthquake and tsunami struck nuclear power plants in Japan, and an explosion occurred. This event has been dubbed the worst nuclear meltdown since Chernobyl, but the full extent of damage, human health effects, and environmental impacts will not be known for several years. The elimination of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II with atomic bombs began an era where instant annihilation on a massive scale is possible. By the early 21st century, other nations and organizations, particularly China and the European Space Agency, had launched missiles into space. The enormous expense of space travel meant only the wealthiest nations could afford it. Concerns over high population rates led some nations, mainly China and India, to initiate government policies to limit the number of births. China enacted a one-child policy aimed at urban couples. By the year 2000, China's population was over 1 billion. India's government adopted a national population policy which incorporated many attempts to curb birth rates, but its population continued to climb. India was an early participant in the Green Revolution in the 1960s. New hybrid rice crops, grown in combination with strong pesticides, produced very high yields, so much that India seemed to end its long cycle of periodic famine and become a leader in the rice exports. National disasters such as droughts and floods in India killed still millions more in the era 1900 to present. Beginning in the late 19th century, electrical power arrived in homes and businesses that were located in cities in the United States and Western Europe. Television gained popularity after World War II, so much so that by the 1960s in the U.S., more homes had televisions than indoor toilets. The first electronic computer was developed in the United States in the late 1940s, and it took up a whole room. A race to the moon fired Cold War imaginations in the 1960s and was won by the United States. The telephone was mainly used by the rich and privileged in Europe until the 1920s. Automobiles made it easier for Europeans to travel to distant vacation spots, which could also mean other countries. The great civilized powers of Europe had set out to destroy each other with weapons produced by the Industrial Revolution, and about 20 million people were killed. After World War II, famine struck Europe. World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, caused more damage to Europe economically, politically, and socially than had ever been seen before. The war had many causes, chief among them were the alliance system, the arms race, imperialism, and nationalism. The main alliance during the war were the Allied and Central Powers. The Allied powers were made up of Russia, England, France, and eventually the U.S. The Central Powers were made up of Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. New advancements such as machine guns, poison gas, airplanes, and submarines changed military tactics and the way wars were fought altogether. Only in 1917 did the U.S. enter the war, which with additional support of U.S. troops ended the war in 1918. Around 20 million soldiers and civilians alike were killed during the war, which caused social, economic, and political despair for many years. Political destruction from the war also caused the fall of the Austrian, German, Ottoman, and Russian empires shortly after World War I. Between the two world wars, the Great Depression, which started in 1929, wreaked havoc on the global economy, especially for the U.S. Overproduction of goods in the U.S. as well as the struggling of European nations to pay for loans from the U.S. caused great financial damage. In the 1930s, many of the governments of the affected nations reorganized to become more financially stable. Communist nations such as Russia were isolated from the global economy as many countries wanted nothing to do with them, so they were not hit as hard by the Great Depression. World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, outdid World War I in almost every way. World War II was longer than World War I. Military technology had improved. The war was more global than World War I, and the number of deaths during the war skyrocketed. The war officially started in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland under the rule of Adolf Hitler. Hitler gained power in 1934 through use of propaganda, lies, and murder, which eventually gave him absolute power over Germany. During World War II, the main groups were the Allied and Axis powers. England, France, Poland, and most of Western Europe formed the Allied powers, while Germany, Italy, and Japan formed the original Axis powers. The US and the USSR eventually joined the Allies. The war ended in 1945 and the United Nations was created, which eventually sent troops to fight in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. The Cold War started almost right away after the end of World War II. The capitalist groups within the Allied powers competed with communist USSR and its allies within the Allied powers as well, which caused great tension within the winning side of World War II. The capitalist side was represented by the U.S., while the communists were represented by the USSR. This tension was caused by many things, but chief among them was the fact that the USSR was putting troops into countries in Eastern Europe, in the fear of both the U.S. and the USSR that the other would try to launch an invasion of Europe. General distrust between the nations spawned a tension between the U.S. and the USSR. During the Cold War, the U.S. formed alliances with Western European nations. This was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The USSR, in response, made the Warsaw Pact with Eastern Europe. This caused even more tension between the nations. The Korean War in 1950 was a large part of this tension between capitalist and communist ideals, as when communist North Korea invaded pro-West South Korea, the UN sent troops to aid South Korea. China also sent troops to support North Korea. After 3 years, the borders of North and South Korea were negotiated, and the war was ended, although the U.S. announced a global plan to prevent the spread of communism. Soon, though, the conflict in Vietnam began. The situation in Vietnam was similar to the situation in Korea, as communist North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, but the U.S. again got involved. The U.S. eventually pulled out, though, and Vietnam became a communist nation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 also contributed to the tensions of the Cold War. This brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear warfare when the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, even though the U.S. had missiles in neighboring countries to Russia, mainly Turkey. Eventually, missiles were removed from both Cuba and Turkey, and the crisis blew over. Tensions from the Cold War had blown over since this incident. Many other countries now have the capacity to fire nuclear missiles, such as India, Pakistan, Israel, and India. Authoritarian government systems such as communism have emerged repeatedly for many years, but saw a high point in the 1900s. Communism in Russia at that time is a major example of this. As the USSR was a world power after World War II, they began to spread communism aggressively. Chinese rebellions against the imperial dynasty of the time led to communism in China as well. Other countries such as North Korea and North Vietnam have accepted communism as well. Decolonization was a large part of the 20th century. During this time period, almost all of the colonies settled by Europe gained their independence back and power returned to local rule. India was the first and the largest to gain their independence from European control. The resistance movement that eventually gained independence for the country was headed by Mahatma Gandhi, who led nonviolent resistance. India was not united, though, as areas split off to become Pakistan and Bangladesh in what is now called the Partition of India. After decolonization, some former colonies had great success, but many struggled, as Africa does because of its lack of industrialization. Also, a policy of South Africa is called apartheid, which basically says that whites of mostly European descent have full political rights, while blacks had very little or none for most of the 1900s. There were also a number of political rebellions throughout the 1900s. One example would be the Mexican Rebellion of 1910, which promised social, political, and economic, as well as educational reforms. These reforms did not take effect until the 1930s, though. These land reforms faded shortly after World War II, though, as the government allowed foreign powers to buy land in Mexico. Another rebellion that took place was the Iranian Rebellion of 1979. The Shah, or acting leader, was forced out of office and replaced by an anti-Western Muslim leader who diminished female civil rights and even supported radical Muslim groups such as Al-Qaeda. Globalization started when organizations formed together for international cooperation. Telecommunication unions were founded in the late 19th century and were part of the United Nations after World War II. They had jobs for agreements between nations regarding exchange in international mail and communication, such as telephone, radio, and internet usage. There was an Olympic committee that was formed to promote international understanding throughout sports. G7 was an organization representing the interests of the world's 7 largest economies. The communist version was Comcon. It was disbanded after the fall of communism in Russia and Eastern Europe. The EU was formed by European nations to lower trade barriers to compete against the U.S. economy. In 1993, most of the 12 member nations from Europe went to a single monetary unit, the euro. England did not participate. After the fall of communism in Europe, the EU invited Europe nations to join. In 1960, oil-rich nations organized into a cartel that sought to regulate the global price of oil. It became known as OPEC. Arab people raised prices and reduced exports of oil to Europe and the United States after the Arab-Israeli War. The West supported Israel in that war, and many Arab leaders in OPEC pushed to punish Europe and the United States for that support. These combinations damaged effects on the West's economy. Inflation soared and unemployment went up. After World War II, ideals about human rights gained acceptance in many places. In 1948, the United Nations showed the concepts from the Nuremberg trials with its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Among these rights are freedom of speech and religion, the right to live, liberty, and personal security, freedom of movement from another country or within a country, and the right to a fair trial, work, and education. The West was the center of the world's economy and had the most multinational corporations. The USA produced 50% of the world's products for most of the World War II era and had the means through its global corporations to distribute its goods around the world. Cultural examples include U.S. clothing styles, music, movies, and television shows. Sports were a global phenomenon. U.S. sports such as baseball and basketball had participants and fans in Europe and Asia, so much so that European and Asian athletes were playing for teams in the United States.